Hello, welcome to the debate. I'm Papadopoulos. On the gathering of 29 countries that are supposed to be allies to celebrate NATO's 70th anniversary, the organization as a whole appears to be divided, more so since the election of Trump 3 years ago. U.S. President Donald Trump has lashed out at European allies before this NATO anniversary summit in London, singling out France's Emmanuel Macron for, quote, very nasty comments on the alliance, and Germany for spending too little on defense. In this edition of the debate, we will look at whether NATO still has relevance and how Russia is still accusing NATO of its expansionist policies, which it says threatens Moscow. Before starting tonight's show, however, let's ask Press TV correspondent Robert Inlakesh about the protests against NATO in London. Robert, what can you tell us about the protests happening there?
Well, of course, the protest has been in many different spots of London today. It has been quite large in different areas, and of course people are very concerned specifically about Donald Trump's visit to the United Kingdom, how he's coming here, of course accusing NATO allies of all different things, and a lot of people, of course, in the anti-war camp in the country don't want him here. Also, another big issue, and it's a big issue in the general election upcoming in the United Kingdom, is the privatization of the NHS. Of course, he's been interfering as well in UK politics by let's say, not straightforward endorsing of Boris Johnson, but saying Boris Johnson is his friend, despite the fact that Donald Trump said he will not be interfering in the politics of the United Kingdom. And of course, it's a tense situation here with Emmanuel Macron lashing out at a number of NATO member states. There's been clashes between Greece and Turkey as well, due to a military alliance between Turkey and Libya, and of course Russia is in the mix here too. So it's a very hostile environment, and some would say more divided than ever.
Thank you very much for that, Robert Inlakesh. Let's bring in our guest, author and lecturer Jonathan Fryer, joins us also from London, and we have editor at Politics First, Marcus Papadopoulos, who also joins us from London. Everybody from London, great. So let's first go to you, Marcus Papadopoulos. Looking at some of the live images that we had there coming through on the streets of London, it said all the placards were against Trump, and we came into this this debate with how NATO is divided. How much of a division in NATO is created by the presence of Donald Trump?
Let me set the scene first of all by saying that NATO is an aggressive, expansionist, criminal, terrorist-supporting and decadent organization that exists today for one purpose and one purpose only: to maintain American global hegemony and to enhance American global hegemony. The argument that NATO was established to defend Western Europe from the clutches of the Soviet Union was simply laughable. Soviet Russia wanted security in Eastern Europe so that no army could attack Russia again. Because let us not forget, the Soviet people incurred the brunt of Hitler's war machine. 27 million Soviet people perished in the Second World War. So how on earth could a country that lost millions of people want another war? No, NATO was established to keep the Russians out of Europe, the Germans down in Europe, and the Americans in Europe. Now, if we fast forward to 2019, yes, there are divisions within NATO, and that is no surprise, because in my opinion, NATO has overstretched itself. It overstretched itself by expanding beyond Germany's eastern borders into Eastern Europe and into the Baltic states. And also, NATO has a lot of very diverse members, most notably, of course, Greece and Turkey, who are traditional enemies to each other. So it's not so much that Donald Trump is the president of America and therefore the de facto leader of NATO that these divisions are becoming more and more pronounced. It could be any other person sitting in the White House. The fact is that today NATO has overstretched itself. NATO is a very diverse military organization, and more people in the world are becoming aware of its criminal organization. Let us not forget, Libya is today a failed state. There are human slave pits in the Libyan capital, Tripoli, because of NATO intervention in 2011. Let us also not forget, in 1999, how Serbia was bombed relentlessly, how uranium was dropped on Serbian civilians. That is the true reality of NATO.
Jonathan Fryer, so we heard about how NATO is expansionist. We heard that it's a criminal organization in some sense. Do you agree with the viewpoints that Marcus Papadopoulos, our guest in London, has?
No, I think we're going to have a very lively debate, because I would have quite a different viewpoint regarding not only the establishment of NATO but its current role today. I think there is no doubt that there was perceived here in Europe a real threat from the Soviet Union. We must remember that towards the end of the Second World War, the Soviet Union, which had already forcefully incorporated the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, then occupied Poland and Eastern Germany, Czechoslovakia and so on. So undoubtedly NATO was set up for that. But of course that reason now has gone, though the Baltic states in particular and Poland still feel in a dangerous situation. And this is the cause of a lot of the disagreement at the NATO meetings here in England today and tomorrow, because there are a group of countries, including Britain, which want to support the request of the Baltic states and Poland to bring in new plans for rapid deployment if there were ever to be a Russian attack on those states. And Turkey, however, has said, no, we will not agree to that unless you agree, the European states, to brand the YPG in northern Syria, the Kurdish forces there, as well as the PKK inside Turkey itself, as terrorists. And because NATO decisions have to be unanimous, there is a sort of standoff at the moment because of that.
So let's look at again, the Russian threat that is thrown around quite easily, Marcus Papadopoulos. What indications are there that Russia is a threat, that it has required NATO to expand to within Europe's borders, and maybe more so in the plans or in the works?
Well, the perceived Russian threat in 2019 is a historical phenomenon. For 500 years in Europe, Russia has been perceived, and I emphasize the word perceived, as a threat to Western Europe, as a threat to Western civilization, as a threat to Western freedoms. Tsarist Russia was depicted as a threat. Soviet Russia was depicted as a threat, and modern-day Russia is depicted as a threat. The fundamental weakness in the argument that Russia is a threat is that it is not corroborated with any evidence. If we go back to the early 19th century, it wasn't Russia that began a European war. It was France under Napoleon Bonaparte, and it was France that invaded Russia in 1812. If we have a look in World War I, it wasn't Russia that started World War I. The German Empire invaded Russia. And if we have a look in the Second World War, Nazi Germany invaded Russia, and Russia lost 27 million of its people. And we are having this discussion today because of the Soviet sacrifices. Because if it not had been for the Red Army, then Hitler would have won the Second World War. Britain would have eventually been conquered. So this idea that Russia is a threat is just simply fanciful. And also as well, I'd like to pick up on something that the previous guest said about Russia having invaded Poland. No, Russia incorporated eastern Poland, a traditional Russian area. And when you see the footage of the Red Army going in to that part of Poland that had been given to Poland after the First World War, the Red Army didn't fire one bullet. Millions of Belarusians met the Red Army with flowers, and they were jubilant to see them there. No, today, if you want to see who causes wars in the world, ask yourself, who has invaded and bombed so many countries in the last 20 years? Well, it's not Russia. It's America and her allies, most notably Britain, but also one of America's most potent weapons, NATO.
Okay, Jonathan Fryer, does he have a point there?
Well, I don't think it's completely true that Russia hasn't caused some reason for concern. We have to remember that Russia annexed the Crimea, and there is currently fighting in East Ukraine with Russian backing, and similarly Russia annexed small parts of Georgia as well, and that's the main reason why the Baltic states and Poland are so concerned that that could happen. I don't think anyone is arguing that there is an imminent threat, but the idea is that the NATO should be prepared should it happen. And we have to remember, of course, that there is, under Article 5 of the NATO treaty, if any member state is attacked by an outside power, not necessarily Russia, but anybody, then all of the other member states are obliged to come to the rescue of that country. And therefore, it's very important that
I'm glad
there
you
is
brought that
a
up.
Consensus.
Yeah, that's a
very
point that we need
important.
to elaborate on a little bit here, Marcus Papadopoulos, because is it true? I mean, you know, if that's the case, what if one of the countries wants to attack another country and not all agree? Can that country go ahead and do it?
Well, of course, we're hearing this argument, another unsubstantiated argument, that Russia poses a threat to the Baltic states. And at the moment in Washington and also in London and Paris and Berlin, there is talk within the corridors of power in those countries whether a Russian invasion of the Baltic states should be met with a NATO counter-offensive. And I am certainly hearing from some people in London, some very senior people, that the view in America and also in Britain, but to a lesser extent in Britain and to a lesser extent in Germany, is that the Baltic states would not be, or what I should say is, the Baltic states are not worth a nuclear war in which there would be nuclear Armageddon, and Russia and America, not only would they destroy each other, but they would take the world with them.
Okay.
So there are a number of countries in Europe who are in NATO who are not committed to Article 5. Certainly some of them are, Poland and the Baltic states. But then it worked in the interests of Poland and the Baltic states to hype up the so-called Russian threat, because then they receive more and more economic aid from the West and more military aid from the West.
Okay. There's this idea of a European army, Jonathan Fryer. That's been said time and again by the EU and, of course, certain countries from within the EU. Does that mean that the European countries are not finding relevance in NATO?
No, I think it's an understanding that there is considerable pressure from Washington, even before President Trump took over, for Europe to be more responsible for its own defense and not to rely so much on the United States. And Mr. Trump has been pushing this very hard in recent months. And that's why certain countries are, particularly France, for example, are quite attracted by the idea of a European army. But several other countries, including Britain, incidentally, are strongly opposed to that idea, although there is Anglo-French cooperation in certain military exercises and in weapons production. There is strong popular opposition in Britain and several other European states to the idea of Europe becoming a military power itself, particularly a sort of EU army that in principle would cover all the EU member states. Though we have to remember, of course, several EU member states such as Ireland, Austria, Sweden, Finland are not members of NATO.
Okay, we need to take a little time out here and listen to one of the statements that was made and the reaction that it got from the U.S. President, a statement coming from the French President Emmanuel Macron. Let's take a listen to that and see what he said.
The debate.
And I heard that President Macron said NATO is brain dead. I think that's very insulting to a lot of different forces, including a man that does a very good job in running NATO. Now, it has a great purpose, especially with the fact that NATO is becoming much more flexible in terms of what it looks at. It's a tough statement, though, when you make a statement like that. That is a very, very nasty statement to essentially 28, including them, 28 countries. I think that you know, you have a very high unemployment rate in France. France is not doing well economically at all. They're starting to tax other people's products, so therefore we go and tax them. It's just taking place right now on technology, and we're doing their wines and everything else. And it's a very tough statement to make when you have such difficulty in France. You look at what's happened with the yellow vests, or you look at what's going on during certain parts of their season. They've had a very rough year. And you just can't go around making statements like that about NATO. It's very disrespectful.
The debate. Only on Press TV.
Well, that's interesting. Donald Trump calling Emmanuel Macron disrespectful. But what he said in reaction to this brain dead, NATO being brain dead, Marcus Papadopoulos, it's telling the way that the U.S. president looks at it in terms of what's happening in France, tying in the economy, and then saying that NATO is relevant in that regards, and that he shouldn't call NATO, he shouldn't have called NATO brain dead. What I'm curious about is, does one's economy, if it's not doing well, then require a military establishment like NATO to exist to counter it? Because that's one way of looking at how Trump reacted to the French president.
Well, of course, for a number of years now, there has been quite significant tension amongst NATO member states about whether each member is meeting the percentage commitment annually for the NATO budget. Now, the Americans and the British are alleging that other countries in NATO are not doing their bit. But I think it's just preposterous to hear talk of increasing NATO's presence on Russia's western borders, which will mean more money required for NATO, which means NATO member states having to give more. It's preposterous to hear about a European army. I mean, the economies of Europe are not in a very good shape. There are numerous problems that have besetted numerous NATO member states for many years now. I don't think it's in the interest, for example, for the Greek taxpayer to have to contribute more to the NATO budget when public services in Greece are really on their knees. And what we need now is empathy from on behalf of American and British and NATO leaders in general. Because do you know something? The Kremlin and the Russian people are paranoid about their security. They see NATO on its western borders. They hear talk about a European army, and instinctively the Kremlin and the ordinary Russian is concerned about that. Why? Because how many times over history has Russia been invaded from its western borders? The Polish-Lithuanian Confederation invaded Russia. Charles XII of Sweden invaded Russia. Napoleon invaded Russia. The Kaiser invaded Russia. Hitler invaded Russia. It is a very provocative move by NATO to be on Russia's western borders, and Russia has a right to national security. And if people in America and Britain, ordinary people, knew about how many times Russia has been invaded over centuries, they would be sympathetic to the concerns of the Kremlin and ordinary Russians.
Jonathan Fryer, Donald Trump in that press conference with Emmanuel Macron talked about threats coming from Iraq and threats coming from Iran, saying that protests in both of those countries are dangerous, and then tying in NATO's relevance in that regards. Why is this interchanging of solving problems militarily so easily done when it comes to American leadership, not just in this case, for Trump to be that way, but previous U.S. administrations, as if there's not enough military built up by the U.S. itself, saying that there are protests in these countries, okay, NATO is relevant.
Well, obviously, indirectly, it isn't relevant. I mean, Mr. Trump does tend to go off in all sorts of directions, and we heard from the quote used earlier where he was talking about France's internal economic situation and the yellow vest protesters. It's nothing whatsoever to do with NATO at all. I think it's interesting to point out, by the way, that, you know, when Mr. Macron made his statement about NATO being brain dead a few weeks ago, this was in direct response to Donald Trump pulling out the American troops from northern Syria without informing other members of NATO, which is a complete violation of the normal dealings within NATO. And obviously Mr. Macron, perhaps exaggerating in his terminology, was nonetheless trying to provoke the Americans to realize that this had been perhaps rather a bad mistake, and also asking the rest of the NATO members, were Turkey to be attacked then out of Syria, would that mean that other NATO member states would have to come to Turkey's defense? So this is why he was talking about being brain dead. Mr. Trump seems to have got completely the wrong end of the stick, not for the first time, and certainly talking about demonstrations in Iran or Iraq or anywhere else is really quite irrelevant to the main concerns of NATO at the moment.
Okay, we got about 30 seconds. It's interesting that Marcus Papadopoulos, Jonathan Fryer talks about the U.S. being in Syria and how you know, its withdrawal then would make other NATO members concerned. The U.S. in Syria illegally. So the reality is twisted to the point that it makes others think that it was okay for the U.S. to be in Syria in the first place. So my final question to you is, where do you see NATO and its future? If you can, please, in 30 seconds.
In the interests of peace and stability in Europe and across the world, the demise of NATO would be a great boost to peace and stability. But regrettably, I do not foresee that in the short term. I do not foresee that in the long term. America is a formidable power. America has billions of dollars to spend each year. America needs NATO to safeguard and strengthen its global dominance. America has poured hundreds of millions of dollars into Ukraine since the coup at the beginning of 2014. Even though most of that money has gone on corruption in Ukraine, it has given America a very strong foothold in Ukraine and through it in the Black Sea. So NATO is a repulsive, dangerous organization, but it's not going to collapse.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much for that. Editor at Politics First, Marcus Papadopoulos. And we had Jonathan Fryer, who's a journalist and a commentator. That does it for this edition of The Debate. Do tune in next time. From me, Goodbye. Until next time.